members of the Citizens Council. The only good human is a dead human! Damn you all to hell!
Within a month of Planet of the Apes release, the head of Fox Studios, Richard D. Zanuck, and Planet of the Apes producer, Mort Abrahams and Arthur P. Jacobs, had a lot to celebrate. Apes was a huge success. After a meeting, they were walking across the lot when a fellow manager at Fox, Stan Hugh, said, "Why don't you do a sequel?" To which Abrams recalled, "You've got to be kidding. How?" He said, "You think about it." Abrahams remembered the conversation because he kept dwelling on it after it happened, and ideas came into his head, and he went to Arthur P. Jacobs to say that he had a crazy idea about how to do a sequel. So the two producers followed their formula for the first film and approached Rod Serling to pen the first version of this intended sequel. He got to work quickly and made a quick treatment of the proposed sequel. The treatment had Taylor and Nova entering the Forbidden Zone, where they find remnants of a human city, weapons, and an airplane. Taylor begins battling the apes by using the plane and weapons, but the apes get the upper hand and corner him. He seems bound for death, but suddenly a second spacecraft lands, and human astronauts from the past save Taylor. After the apes flee, the astronauts offer to take Taylor home, but Taylor literally chooses a woman who is a stranger astronaut to stay with him as a mate, not Nova, and decides to stay behind to rebuild humanity. After reviewing this disappointing script, Mort Abrahams was not keen to the ideas, and in April 1968, he expressed this to Serling, who was really very busy with lots of projects. Mort suggested that the film needed to have a Statue of Liberty shock moment. Serling suggested two other concepts within a month. The first was that Taylor and Nova would discover another spaceship and travel backwards or forwards in time, whichever they decided, which would be like a new adventure. Or they could find a spacecraft and escape the planet with a bunch of humans, and they would land on a new planet to create a colony, only to find that they were on another planet of the apes. But things fell apart thereafter because Serling had other projects to tend to, and the timeline they wanted the script done was just not feasible for Serling to make. So the producers turned to their other option, Pierre Boulle, author of The Planet of the Apes. Boulle stated he didn't know how to write a screenplay, and it was Jacobs who showed him the first film screenplay. Boulle worked fast, and his first version of the sequel for American Eyes was finished on July 22, 1968. The manuscript was called Planet of the Men. The film starts with Taylor and Nova, who have a son named Sirius. They have now crossed the Forbidden Zone and found primitive humans who they are now re-educating over the span of many years. We then return to Ape City, where they pick up from the last film. Zira and Cornelius are in jail, and chimp protesters force Dr. Zaius to set them free. As their society is stricken by divisions over what to do next, humans are starting to resurge, and in ape society, the military elements gain control, led by the guerrilla field marshal Ursus, and he is backed by Zaius. The two leaders intend to go to war, and it begins. Although war for survival was a necessity, the sheer number of humans is now so overwhelming that it's clear the apes will lose. Taylor, along with his now older son, leads the armies, and Taylor suggests diplomacy to the humans since they have the upper hand, but the humans are against it. With no choice, Taylor and his son invade Ape City. During the battle, Taylor tries to help Zira, but he is killed by a young human when he tries to do so. The humans utterly destroy the apes and force them back into their primitive states. After time passes, during the last scene, Dr. Zaius is in a cage at a circus, barely able to articulate, harkening back to the foreboding vision he spoke about in the first film. Pierre was very frustrated with screenwriting, though. His main problem was that everything that he wrote kept changing whenever the producers looked at it. They accepted the treatment that I worked on, but they made so many changes that very few of my ideas were left. It was completely different from what they finally used on the screen. I used the end of the first film as my starting point. I played the game, but my film was never made. Arthur P. Jacobs' response to the Frenchman's version was clinical. He did write a treatment for the sequel titled Planet of Men, but it wasn't cinematic. The next incarnation of Planet of the Apes 2 was an outline, and it is a bit in question as to whom wrote it, as it was linked to both Serling and Boulle. However, it is apparent Serling or Boulle did not write it. Boulle stated he only wrote one, which we just covered, and Serling's signature typewriter was not used for this proposal. It is suggested that after the two tried their crack at the sequel, a person familiar with both of their works wrote the new treatment, which was called The Dark Side of the Earth, and it did have a shock ending that Mort Abrahams had requested earlier. This version has Taylor and Nova crossing the Forbidden Zone to find a 20th century town where intellectual normal humans live. They live with them for a while until another spaceship crashes and one astronaut survives. The surviving astronaut is no Boy Scout, though. He wants to avenge the humans on the apes and begins leading an army to destroy ape society. Taylor does not take part in it and is disgusted by the carnage and cruelty by the humans against the apes. Finally, the war is won, and the apes begin reverting back to their primitive states, like Boulle's version, and Taylor decides to act. Taylor finds a nuclear bomb. He straps it to his ship and crashes into the human city, igniting everything, and there is an image of a flower and a bee at the end of the movie. After the versions so far, Mort Abrahams had a revelation. Finally, having thought about it for several weeks, I abandoned the idea of trying to top the Statue of Liberty shot. From this new perspective, they began cultivating the idea of mutant humans who could use their minds to create illusions, and from that would come visual things they could do in the film. Just after the summer of 1968, Mort talked with one of the co-writers of the most popular James Bond film at the time, Goldfinger. The writer was a poet turned screenwriter named Paul Dean, and he agreed to make a treatment for the film. His treatment would be turned in on September 13th, 1968, and it was called Planet of the Apes Revisited. Again, we start with Taylor entering the Forbidden Zone with Nova, and they must go through snowdrifts, fog, and arid deserts, which turn out to be illusions. They discover a race of mutated humans who are survivors from the Great War in an underground New York City. They worship an atomic bomb, and they are isolationist in nature. The mutants are worried, though, because ape scouts and certain humans have encroached on their territory, so they ask Taylor to spy on the apes to get them intel over the intentions of the apes. Back in Ape City, General Ursus is preaching that they need living room, even though most humans have been captured. So, Ursus leads a grand army to take lands in the Forbidden Zone and discovers tall buildings. They deduce that inhabitants are near and therefore redeploy to plan an invasion of said city. Meanwhile, Taylor arrives with Nova in Ape City and they take refuge thanks to Zira and Cornelius, who keeps them in their home where Nova gives birth to Taylor's son Sirius. After a short time of secret meetings with chimpanzee leaders and youthful orangutans, Taylor heads back to warn the mutants of an army that will eventually find them. While returning, Nova is shot and killed by a gorilla. When the war for the human city begins, all of the military are engaged there. As a result of their absence, the chimpanzees take over Ape City. At the battlefront, even Zaius has doubts. When a missile rises up from the ground, Taylor warns everyone not to touch it, and Ursus actually shoots Zaius. Taylor flees to Ape City. Ursus is captured, and his soldiers break the supports of the missile, and it explodes, destroying the mutant city and the gorilla army. Humans are free from their cages, and we then jump 54 years later, where a chimpanzee teacher is teaching a class to humans and apes. Then we cut to a forbidden zone, where some mutated apes emerge from a cave and shoot a dove. They really liked Paul's ideas, and now they needed to find a director. So they turned towards Don Medford, who worked on a ton of popular TV series like The Twilight Zone, Man from U.N.C.L.E., The Fugitive, and others. But there were several problems with Don, and they manifested quickly. The first was Charlton Heston, who was now approached with a script, and he shot them down immediately. You know there is no sequel. There's only the one story. You can have another picture about further adventures among the monkeys, and it can be an exciting film, but creatively, there is no film. With Heston refusing to appear in a new movie, they had to change the script to account for his absence. And without their big star, 20th Century Fox quickly halved the budget because Fox was having some money problems thanks to some movies that had failed at the box office recently, and their money reserves were very tight. Don also grew very agitated with the script because he felt Mort was influencing the script in a negative way into a point that he described as hackneyed, which would later be confirmed. Finally, Don had enough and quit the project. When he heard his replacement director was going to be Ted Post, who made Hang 'em High, which is a great film, you gotta see that one, Don called him to warn him. He called me and said, "You're going to be in deep trouble with it because of the way they were attacking it. Not Paul Dean so much as Mort, who was trying hard to twist and turn it in a certain kind of direction." Realizing that he was in a potentially disastrous situation, Post voiced that they had to have Heston in the film. I didn't want to do the picture without him because I didn't want the audience to think we would be giving them less. I wanted to have him there because it would legitimize the sequel. At first, the studio offered more money to Heston to buy his involvement, but Heston was really proud of the first film and didn't want to see it tainted in any way, and he just didn't like the script. So Richard Zanuck set up a meeting with Heston, and they discussed the predicament the studio was in making a sequel without him. Finally, Heston gave an olive branch. I'll tell you what if I'm in it and you kill me in the first scene? Zanuck agreed to the idea and quickly followed up with, "That's okay, we can work out some kind of plot, but you gotta be in it or we can't get started." This meeting concluded with an agreement, and Heston wanted his payment to be given to a charity that he would choose. Later, Heston would write in his diary on September 30th, 1968, "Fox is now willing to accept my proposal to do a brief transition bit for them in their new version of Apes. I don't think it's a good idea, but of course, I'll carry out my promise to them." Post, who was locked as director, tried to improve the script and suggested changes and found that it was not easy thanks to Abrahams. I was very unhappy with the script, and I thought the script was far from what it should have been, and the input of one particular individual, Mort Abrahams, was so cliched and so hackneyed and so absolutely impossible to change or rectify or even in some way improve because of his power and his highly articulate way of getting his power across, that I think he screwed it. To piggyback on this quote, I have to note by all sources that Mort Abrahams completely manipulated the script and story. It's a typical tale where a money man who started out with Bank of America becomes a producer and believes he knows more than writers and other talents involved in the film. In the first Apes, it was Arthur P. Jacobs, Charlton Heston, and the screenwriters who had the majority of creative power. In the second film, Heston was only a hired hand, and Jacobs was busy producing Goodbye, Mr. Chips, and The Chairman during the evolutionary stages of Planet of the Apes 2. This vacuum allowed Abrahams to seize control, and everyone seemed solidly against many things in the film, especially the ending of the movie, which the writer, director, and actors resisted. So it is clear those individuals were not in control of the direction of this film. With Heston taking a lesser part in the film, Thus came the creation of the second astronaut, John Brent, and Paul Dean would finish his first draft screenplay called Planet of the Apes Revisited, dated December 20th, 1968. The story begins with Taylor seemingly dying in a mutant trap, and Brent arrives on the planet following Taylor's trajectory. Brent finds Nova, then the apes, then the mutants, and it plays out like the last version. The surprise is that they find Taylor, escape, and the three debate whether they should run for it in the spacecraft or decide to stay. The story then jumps 47 years in the future, where children are being taught how Taylor brought peace and harmony to the survivors of the planet, and in the class there are half-human, half-ape children. And then the final shot has mutated apes leaving caves in the Forbidden Zone. In early 1969, the makeup team began work on some of the concepts, once again under the direction of Dan Stripke, and one of the earlier tests tracked the idea of a human-ape hybrid child. Some tests were done in late 1968, but these were mainly done in early 1969. The idea would inevitably die because many were worried that the MPAA would have issues with interspecies breeding. A lot of the casting was pretty straightforward, with veterans reprising their role like Kim Hunter as Zira, Maurice Evans as Zaius. Roddy McDowall could not return as he was directing his first film called The Ballad of Tam Lin. So David Watson was cast to take over the mantle as Cornelius, and to be honest, I think he did a pretty good job. Linda Harrison stated she was ambivalent to return, as she was focused on her marriage. I was no longer totally concerned with being an actress. I don't even want to do another picture, but since this is a sequel to the one I did last year, I felt obligated. The role of General Ursus was offered to Orson Welles, but the actor had no desire to be behind a mask. Rumor had it they went to Ernest Borgnine as well. In the end, they offered the role to James Gregory, who was actually an ingenious pick as he was perfect for this part. Finally, the stand-in for Taylor as the lead was cast, and originally Burt Reynolds was approached, but he turned it down flat. So they went to James Franciscus, and they gave him a script to read. When I read the script, I thought that the story was fine, but the character really wasn't much of a man in essence. He was led around by the nose saying yes and no, so I told my agent Dick Clayton, I can see why Burt turned this down. The character, the way it's drawn, is no man. So James had a meeting with Mort Abrahams and Arthur Jacobs, and he said he would sign if they did some work here and there on the character. Agreements were made, and James wasted no time. He went right to director Ted Post with a writer friend, and to Post's delight, they worked on Brent's character over the weekend. What we did was to make suggestions or do things that would make it legitimate. I know one thing, much of it ended up on the screen. This was before shooting began, and Mort got angry with the changes and angry with me. Finally, I said, listen, Mort, actors have to perform this script, and sitting where you are, you don't know whether the scene will work. Abrahams, though irritated, conceded that some ideas were good, and Arthur P. Jacobs was involved since the agreement was between the actor and the two producers. In the end, 54 out of the 60 changes were approved in the rewrite. Heston was given a revised screenplay dated February 3rd, 1969, and 10 days later he wrote in his diary, "The part's longer than I wanted to do, and the latest script's not good. But Fox insists I have to be in the film, or they can't make it." Filming began in February 1969 with a new title called Beneath the Planet of the Apes. The film had a $3 million budget now, almost half the original film's budget, which was $5.8 million. The stated reason was sequels make less money than their predecessors, and that Heston was getting paid a big chunk of money, which would actually end up at charity. The good news was that Ape City was still standing at Fox Ranch and just needed minor touch-ups, and a lot of the pre-existing sets were saved, so they could be reutilized for this film. To save money, the Grand Central 42nd Street set from Hello, Dolly was redressed for this film. The sets also impressed most of the cast, including a little-known male boy at the time, who often came to the sets and would later marvel about them.
And they just sprayed it with foam. It's all styrofoam. It was very cool to be on that set.
Even during filming, the script was a problem for Ted Post. He said the script was so cliched and didn't allow you to relate to the principles in favor of action. He even spoke to first Planet of the Apes director Frank Schaffner about the script, and Frank told him to get with Michael Wilson, who was interested in helping. But of course the studio didn't want to pay Michael because they thought he cost too much money, so they settled for Paul Dean, who was cheaper. The actors still had issues with the script, but mainly talked between each other about it rather than make a big deal. Jesus Christ, Chuck, have you read this piece of crap? Heston would later recount their discussions in his diary. One such conversation was during late March. Jim Franciscus called, frothing at what he feels are the inadequacies of the Apes 2 script. I'm inclined to agree, but I don't know how much can be improved. Within weeks of him penning this entry, though, he would try to improve the script, at least for his character, just before he arrived on the set to shoot for 5 days in April. Heston went straight to Zanuck, who was currently battling his own father at Fox and was losing his position. Zanuck was almost out the door, so when Heston came to him, it was easy for Zanuck to give him whatever he asked for. And what did Heston ask for? Well, instead of having a nuclear bomb destroy the human city, he wanted his character to die igniting a nuclear bomb that would destroy the entire world. Thus, Taylor would go out in a blaze of glory. The producer wanted it, so I did as I was told. The bomb went off, the screen went white, the earth was dead. This blindsided so many people who were making the film, because Zanuck gave it as a mandate. When Heston made the changes, it got rid of possible sequels by having no hybrid kids or holding hands between man and ape. At the end of the film, it would just be the end, period. I thought it was a very negative, pessimistic ending, very unhopeful. His conclusion about the picture was a reflection, either consciously or unconsciously, of what he felt. I was under strict orders not to produce a sequel. Fox said there would be no further sequels after this. Kindly destroy the entire world and wind up the series. So, I duly did this, and as you remember, at the end, the world blew up, the screen went white, and the earth was dead. Even though Post would do his duty, at the time, Post and his leading man would plead for an alternate ending. I thought the ending was awful, a picture without hope. I think Ted and I pleaded for someone to survive this mess, be it Chuck's character, or the girl, or Brent's character, somebody far enough away from the explosion, for whatever reason, so that mankind is still left. With the shoot still going, the final screenplay was finished on around April 10th, 1969, almost 2 months into the shoot. And since this script was so late in the shoot, we will not cover this version. Rather, when we cover the movie, we will point out differences in this script as to what we got in the movie. Despite the bleak outlook the production suffered, there were sparks of light here and there. James Gregory, who played Ursus, was always making jokes when he was in costume, lifting spirits on the set. Victor Bueno was an avid gamer and loved to play with fellow actors during downtime. He had many games in his trailer, but one time Don Pedro Coley recalled it didn't end well.
And we go in the back of the trailer to sit down to play these games, and suddenly the trailer goes... and so we're screaming, help us.
So the whole trailer.
The trailer rocked up on 2 wheels and was sitting on his ass. And so the doorway out was way up there.
Don had to climb up the trailer while Victor stayed in the back. Finally, when Don got near the top of the trailer, it tipped back, and when it came down, the mirrors fell and the lights exploded when it balanced. Linda Harrison noted that Heston was the type of actor who was always pondering his role and his political activism. She stated that James Franciscus was a method actor who was very serious, and there was a big difference when she worked with the two. Despite this, Heston was very troubled by his work and the shoot, citing that Ted Post's direction was permissive and that he regretted his decision to return. I find myself tangled in creative discussions in aid of a project in whose creative validity I have no confidence. Despite Heston's lack of confidence in his director, Post did many things to make the movie better despite the constraints of time and budget. He tried his best to elevate the story where he could, and one of those areas was Nova. They had nothing for her to do in this one except just be part of a sequel. In other words, she was so badly conceived in the writing that I had to conceive actions for her to make her belong to the piece. And the big action which I gave her, and I think she came out beautifully with it, was to try to understand what these people were trying to communicate to her. Seeing how Nova turned out to be one of the more memorable performances in this movie only notes how Post did in fact improve the film. And let's not forget his rewrites he had done with Franciscus earlier. Post was trying, but his hands were tied. What I tried to do was to make what was given to me work. I had to apply all the techniques and principles I had ever used as a director to make this picture work. For the music of the film, Jerry Goldsmith was offered to return, but he couldn't because he was currently working with Franklin Schaffner on Patton. So they went with Leonard Rosenman, who would later go on to compose such scores as Star Trek IV and RoboCop 2. The film eventually came in on budget at $2.5 million and would be released on May 26, 1970, and there was little competition going against it. During the week before Apes, a wonderful film called The Landlord was released, but not recognized by many, thus making little like Sammy Davis Jr.'s sequel to Salt and Pepper called One More Time, with Peter Lawford and directed by Jerry Lewis. Suppose They Gave a War and Nobody Came would make just $1 million, while Too Late the Hero with Michael Caine made $1.5. Then there was Norwood with Glenn Campbell and Kim Darby, which made $1.7 million. On May 26, 1970, The Strange Puffin Stuff and The Magic Garden of Stanley Sweetheart made little, even though it was Don Johnson's film debut. Cotton Comes to Harlem also came out and did very well, earning a respectable $5.2 million. Alongside Cotton came Beneath the Planet of the Apes. Apes showed a strong presence for some time, earning $18.9 million. On the following week, May 27, 1970, The Out-of-Towners would perform strong with $7.2 million, along with Two Mules for Sister Sarah, which would earn $5 million. Melvin Van Peebles' debut directing film, Watermelon Man, also came out, earning $1.1 million. This would be followed by two films during the first week of June, George Peppard's The Executioner and Charlton Heston's own Julius Caesar, which he was disappointed in that film too. Beneath the Planet of the Apes did not have the same impact that the first film had. Though it was successful and profitable, it was no phenomenon, and it was very relevant to its time, and we will talk about that in our next video. So with that said, we'll wrap this video up, and while you wait for next week's video, try not to worship any idols.
Wow, you guys worship an unexploded nuclear bomb?
Yeah, but nobody's that observant. It's mainly a Christmas and Easter thing.
If you like what you see here, click like and subscribe. Use super thanks. It helps.